This is going to be, I think, a very interesting conversation with three people who are very well qualified to talk about this. I'll introduce our guests. First of all, Mihir Sharma. He's a journalist. He writes for the New Business Standard. He's based in New Delhi. His latest book is Restart, Last Chance for the Indian Economy. We're delighted to have you with us.
Sure. I mean, I've spent pretty much my lifetime in journalism complaining about people who write books about India. And of course, as for my sins, I wound up writing a book about India. It actually wasn't supposed to be about India. It was a book about the nature of the Indian economy currently and how to fix it or not fix it, depending on what you may prefer. But the tragedy was that you can't write about something like the Indian economy without taking on other aspects of Indian life, about politics, about the caste system, any number of different digressions. So if anything, it's sort of like a funny take on the Indian economy with an enormous number of completely irrelevant but probably amusing digressions. And that's basically it. And that's what I do in my day job as well. I work for a business newspaper where fortunately, it's one of the few newspapers in the country where I can pretty much say anything that I like. Normally, newspapers are very careful about offending people in power, in India in particular, and we're in a position where we, fortunately, can just go ahead and say what we like, which means that I'm generally known as, in the Indian media, as somebody who can't keep his mouth shut.
Okay. Well, Ryan Gattis, as we can see, I'm delighted he took his coat off because his tattoos are remarkable. And actually, he does work with street artists in Los Angeles. He's the author of many books, including the wonderfully titled Kung Fu High School. His latest book is All Involved, and it's set in the 1990s in Los Angeles in the aftermath of the acquittal of the white police officers in the Rodney King trial. And so there are, of course, many parallels to what's happening now. And I just heard good news. Can I share the news about?
Yes, you can share.
HBO has picked up the rights to All Involved, so do stay tuned for that. And Ryan also teaches creative writing, and as part of that, how to write for video games. So, anything else you'd like to add to your bio?
No, you did brilliantly.
Okay,
Thank you.
David Barsamian, for our Boulder audience, really needs no introduction, but I will give one nonetheless. He's the director of Alternative Radio, which is broadcast internationally and features many amazing speakers, Vandana Shiva, Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein. I mean, we could go on. He has co-authored many books with some of those speakers, including Noam Chomsky and Edward Said. And David has a huge body of knowledge on international politics, and particularly India, having written a lot about Kashmir, and that, of course, has led to his own experiences with the Indian bureaucracy. I don't know if you'd like to expand on that, or we can leave our audience wondering.
Well, I was denied entry 4 years ago. I've been visiting India since 1966, and as I was talking to someone earlier today, Kashmir for the Hindu nationalist is quite, to understand how visceral it is, it's very much akin to how Zionists feel about Israel. As soon as any criticism is raised about Israel, or in this case Kashmir, people go berserk and ballistic, and no amount of evidence or facts or documentation counts for anything, because it's very much an emotional issue. So I've been paying a big price for speaking out on Kashmir. I've also been speaking out. This is the centenary of the what is called the first genocide of the 20th century, the Turkish massacre genocide of the Armenians in 1915, and I was in Ankara speaking, and in other parts of Turkey earlier this year to mark that centenary. It's interesting to see which issues are foreground, which issues get in the background, and which issues are completely buried. And I see my job in the alternative, independent, progressive media as shining light in those dark spaces that people in power do not want to have exposed.
Well, we are going to have an interesting conversation around emergent stories, new media narratives. And so I'd like actually all our panelists to just give their initial take on exactly what that means. When we talk about new media, what does that mean for you? Mihir?
Well, I think anything new can only be defined in opposition to what existed earlier, sometimes a caricature of what existed earlier, but an idea, a pre-existing idea. And I think the idea was that you had something called, the media, or the corporate media, or the big media, or whatever people may wish to call it, which was owned by a bunch of people who put their particular class's interests front and center. There was an attempt at objectivity of a particular kind, which frequently many people would claim came down to, in fact, a subjectivity that was not, in fact, transparent to the reader. And you had, and the stories that were frequently told were not the stories that were necessarily coming out of the ground, but the stories that emerged from a conclave of people like me sitting in a room far from the actual, news front lines, deciding what should and should not be go on the front page. That was old media, and now we are told we have new media where essentially the costs of getting a story out from the ground to your drawing room, to your hand, onto your TV have reduced so much, thanks to communications, the internet, and the fact that we all have access to Twitter, have reduced so much that a lot more stories can be told. Now that's broadly what I think the mainstream narrative, well, the alternative, whatever, the current thinking is. I have some questions about whether that's actually true, which we can get into later, but I think that's pretty much what I was taught.
Okay. Ryan?
I would agree with Mihir. I think it's a really great summation of that. I think the only thing that I would add is that it seems to me new media connotes the digital in some way. As an example, I'm part of UGLAR, which is a street art crew in Los Angeles, and we are tasked by the city to add art all over. And one of the things that we tried to do last year was actually add QR codes to a mural. Obviously, people have been painting on walls for many, many years, but we were trying to find ways to make them more interactive, to give people an opportunity to actually connect.
And those are those little black and white
things
absolutely. That you can scan with your smartphone.
Exactly, and give people potentially the ability to tell their own stories through that. And I suppose we could probably talk about it a little bit later, but in many ways that was a failure. I can talk about why. But I think that's initially what I think of with new media. It's not just social media, but it's looking for new opportunities to kind of weld the digital to our present world.
David?
Well, I think this device has had a transformative impact on media and journalism today. It's because of cell phone journalists, that is to say, ordinary people out in the field witnessing, documenting police brutality, police atrocities, has had a tremendous impact. And this isn't a new thing about violence toward minority communities in the United States. I was just looking at a Black Panther pamphlet from the late 1960s. You know what was on the top of their list of demands? Stop police brutality. And now because of the cell phone, 40, 50 years later, we've had case after case being documented. And I also think it's very exciting because it gives the lie to this mythology that's in kind of the mainstream here, that you need a proper degree in journalism, you need to go to the Columbia Journalism School, and then be an apprentice at some newspaper and work your way up. We're at a time now when citizens are becoming journalists and are improvising, and that's very, very exciting. And a major breakthrough is, of course, I think The Intercept, which was created by Pierre Omidyar, one of the eBay founders, I think, which has, given his own background, I won't go into it, has employed some of the most dynamic, exciting, innovative journalists we have in all of journalism in the United States. Jeremy Scahill, Glenn Greenwald, the Academy Award-winning director of Citizen4, Laura Poitras, and many others. So there are many breakthroughs, and breakthrough right here in Boulder is, of course, KGNU, which has been on the air now for 37 years and is one of the best community radio stations in the United States. It's when the last time I was in India, which was 4 years ago, if ever a country needed community radio, it's India and Pakistan.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Mihir.
Well, I mean, sort of that gets me into something that that maybe I can sort of gently question. I agree with you. community radio would help create, in many places, such as this one, a progressive community that can support progressive ideas. Let me put it to you this way. If we have community radio, one of the things that we don't have is, we in fact have a blanket ban in India on discussing the news, on hard news on the radio. That's something that we've always had. TV you can say anything you like, radio you can't. And I want you to do a thought experiment. Now, obviously, bans are bad. I want to make this absolutely clear. I don't support this, this ban on news radio. But would it be the case that if you take away the ban, you would have the kind of thing that you have here in Boulder, which is the ability to create a place where progressive ideas are possible? Remember, even if you're going to talk about the United States, if you want to talk about talk radio overall, has it been a force? Has it pushed this country to the left or to the right? Has it maybe it's pushed a lot of people towards rationality, but it's also created, I think, a pole of people at one end with a great and vast center of gravity that are pushing the rest of the country, perhaps to the right, and we see that in the Republican race right now. So the question one must ask is, obviously these things are good in and of themselves. Community radio is good in and of itself, but will it necessarily, in all circumstances, lead to a progressive outcome? I'm not certain. You say India and Pakistan need community radio. Rwanda had community radio. So, I mean, there are ways in which we have to recognize that these, there are, technology is technology and media is media, and people can use that for good or ill, and sometimes they will use it for ill.
Well, getting back to the panel today, where we're looking very much at new media, and David, you held up your smartphone, which has transformed media production, media consumption for so many people. In many ways, it's democratized media because everybody now can film a video of something and post it to the internet and have millions of people do it. So given that there's so much volume out there being created because of these new media tools, what are the emergent stories that are coming to the forefront? And maybe there's a backside to this, because how do you even go about curating that volume? And are there dynamics that help some stories emerge to the forefront and suppress other stories? Anybody want to jump in?
Well, I think, just to follow up on what I said earlier, that what has been revealed, particularly in a concrete way over the last year, is institutional racism in the United States inside the so-called security forces. And that is, I think, a very important step that has now been taken in terms of getting that information out. I'm also very interested, and there has been very little talk about it at this conference, unfortunately, and that is the war on nature, the ecocide that is going on, that is going to have catastrophic effects. While we're talking about, the horrible situation with refugees streaming into Europe and the ongoing wars from Libya to Yemen to Iraq to Syria and Afghanistan, bombings in Pakistan, underneath sub rosa is this war on nature and the destruction of the environment, which will make all of these issues not irrelevant but moot. If we don't have a habitat, we are in very deep trouble. And I'm very concerned about that, and I just wanted to inject that outside the parameters of this topic. Well,
Ryan, your book, All Involved, as I said, it's centered around the aftermath of the 1990s, the Rodney King trial, white police officers being acquitted, in that case, the Rodney King case. 20-odd years later, we're looking at one of those emergent stories being ongoing police brutality against people of color, and how social media has transformed that narrative in many ways. The Black Lives Matter movement really taking Twitter, Facebook, and new media by storm. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think just to speak a little bit to the previous question, I think one of the things that perhaps is an emergent story in the new media environment is that the hidden becomes visible, or that which has been ignored is put forward. Because Twitter in particular, or perhaps Facebook or anything else, offers an opportunity to broadcast in a new way, and things can become viral through sharing. And I think the beauty of that is that in a previous environment, say for example 1992 LA, people were very much reliant on the television black and white narrative of what was going on in LA. You have an African American man who was beaten by 4 white police officers. They say, actually one of them was Hispanic. That's not something that's ever part of the narrative. And I found that as I was researching. Briseño was one of the officers' names. And the thing that's fascinating, and I think this connects a little bit to what David was saying earlier, is at the time that George Halliday took this video of Rodney King being beaten, camcorders were only recently commercially available. You know, they had only become affordable to the general public in the late 80s, early 90s. But what that did was reveal a truth that a lot of these communities of color that had already been targeted already knew, which is that they are policed very differently from some of the other neighborhoods in the city. And now that everyone ostensibly has a camcorder in their pockets with a smartphone, we're seeing a far more widespread occurrence. And it's very interesting. Again, I don't have answers. I think part of the beauty of my job as a fiction writer is I ask questions. I'm not really here to give anyone answers. But it seems to me that we need to be asking, how long has this been going on? Why is it occurring? And how do we stop it?
Well, Mihir, do you have any thoughts on that? What stories are emerging? Are some stories getting more attention than others, given the sheer volume of how much media is now being created thanks to these new media tools?
Well, I think that, you know, Black Lives Matter is one of the great, I mean, obviously it's not a success story in the sense that it hasn't achieved, you know, even in many ways begun to fix the problem of institutionalized racism in policing in this country. However, what it does show is that sometimes there are stories that exist out there and which people can, one by one, choose and put forward as, and share and turn into big stories, even if they're not big stories from the point of view of commercial media to start off with. However, once again, my question about this frequently is that, let's go to Kashmir, for example. You can now go on Facebook or go on Twitter and you can follow the stories from ordinary Kashmiri young people. You can hear them talking about being frisked or being humiliated by the security forces. You know when somebody is beaten up. These stories which we did not have access to 10 years ago, we do have access to them now if we look for them. All right. The truth is, however, that the aggregation and the creation and the curation of all these stories has become such a difficult task that in many ways you're back to where we started. All right. You're back to relying on someone else to tell you that there is this injustice happening and you need to do something about it. So once again, now it may be easier for you to find a curator who is more in sync with your political ideas than it was earlier. That may or may not be true. I don't think we've proved it yet. But the truth is, yes, these stories are out there, and the big difference is that now, if you look for them, you can find them. 10 years ago, I wanted, well, not 10 years, but 15 years ago, Wikipedia was still young. And one of the things that I wanted to do when Wikipedia started was to create articles about about Kashmir and about, for example, the torture camps that the Indian police used to run there. And there were these well-known torture camps, Papa 1 and Papa 2 they were called, one of which was housed in in what is now the official residence of the leader of the opposition in the Kashmir Assembly. So it's this beautiful house. But I went out to try and find actual stories about these in the mainstream media. And barring Pankaj Mishra in the New York Review of Books, nobody, I mean, there was not a single hit on whatever was before Google at that point. All right. Now, if something like that would happen again today, you know, if you had a torture, the people who went out could not be prevented from getting their stories out. So there would be something if you went out and looked for it. But I am fairly certain that most of us would not necessarily look for it unless it was organized and put in front of us in a way. So we're back to another, you know, an old media job of taking all these things and putting them up for our perusal.
I mean, that goes to a point I think we mentioned earlier, the curation of this. There is such sheer volume of all of this content being created in a very democratic way. But then how did that story get to the top of our newsfeed? I mean, Ryan, David, any thoughts on that?
Well, who controls the narrative? Who controls the microphones and the cameras? There are 4 or 5 corporations now that dominate the media here in the United States. When I started doing this work 30, 40 years ago, that number was 50 or 60, but I wouldn't say it was better 30 or 40 years ago. There were just more outlets then. But as I travel around the country and give talks and try to meet with young people, I detect a very clear skepticism of the media and an enormous amount of suspicion. Now, the suspicion is well placed. When it drifts into cynicism, then we have paralysis. So I'm trying to stimulate and provoke young people to get involved in community radio stations, TV stations, alternative news sources, so that we have a viable alternative to the corporate concentration of media. In terms of Kashmir, which is a story I'm very interested in, you have a very powerful state in relation to a marginal liberation movement or independence movement, whatever you want to call them. And the state has been very skillful, outside of India particularly, in totally dominating the narrative. What people hear about Kashmir in the United States is basically they're Pakistanis, they're terrorists, they're malcontents. They have no legitimate grievances against the Indian state. And so to uncover that, to unravel that for a domestic audience is something I've been trying to do.
Ryan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, just speaking strictly to the importance of curation, I think the more streams, the more voices there are. I think polyphony creates cacophony. When you have these many voices, you have potentially pollution. And it's very difficult. You need someone to parse that, but then it's potentially difficult because what's the transparency level? What are the wishes for that person? Why are they doing it? It becomes again, and perhaps I'm with Mihir on this. How can you know everything about these curators that you're trusting? But at the same time, I think the more new media there is in the world, the more important it is to have people who are trustworthy in some capacity to parse it. And mainly because I think new media creates exhaustion fairly quickly. And how do we...
Just in terms of the sheer volume of
absolutely.
Coming at you.
It never stops. It's kind of the beauty and the dark side of the internet and things like Twitter. There's always 3, 4, 5 things that are tremendously awful, and that's just part of a connected world and having to deal with the difficulties of being human.
Well, digital technology also has sparked an explosion in documentary films. I mean, a week doesn't go by when a new film is not premiered, often of very, very high technical quality, but also content-wise. And there's been a plethora of excellent, excellent films going out there, again, because the technology has become more accessible and affordable. And so it's...
Because it moved to digital. Primarily, and I think, I couldn't agree more. I think it's absolutely the golden age of documentary filmmaking. Whether it's short form or even longer form, it's really tremendously valuable, I think, where we are in this day and age.
Given that digital technology seems to have democratized media making and who can actually produce media, there still is a major divide with people who have access or people who don't have access to that digital technology. There's that term, the digital divide. And even in the US, where you think wireless internet, the internet in general is ubiquitous, never mind other countries, there are millions of people who don't have access to the internet. And
or access is blocked.
Or their access is blocked. And so what are your thoughts on that in terms of how we move forward with emergent stories, this new media narrative, when we're still facing the reality of that digital divide and people either having access blocked or people just don't have access?
Well, it speaks to rising inequality and the depredations of the capitalist economic system here in the United States and elsewhere, which divides the population into winners and losers. And the losers are over there. They're on that side of the digital divide, and the winners are on this side. But to circle back to something earlier, actually, I want to reinforce what Amir said. There is no way of knowing if we capture these new technologies or these radio stations or non-commercial TV stations, what will become of them. There are many instances here in the United States where American Taliban, let's just say Christian fundamentalists, have taken over radio frequencies and use those public channels to use as propaganda. So you're absolutely right about that.
Well, I think on the digital divide, it can be particularly pernicious when it's, for example, in India, where you have a hierarchy of people socially that has been sort of imposed, by tradition. And sometimes what happens is that, let's say in a particular area, a large number of people, you may look at it and say, oh, that's 65% of the population is now online, that's pretty good. And that seems to be people across all income levels, so obviously biased towards the upper end, but there are a lot of very poor people on that as well. What you may or may not know is the caste and the class of the people who irrelevant to, caste, of course, doesn't correlate necessarily perfectly with income. So it may be the case that if you're looking at something that appears to be a completely democratic medium, but in fact systemically excludes a large number of individuals and groups. And so you have to be, again, very, very careful. I mean, I'm always a little worried when, and I know a lot of people like this in new journalists who are almost utopian in their thinking about, oh look, all sorts of people are going to be online and these stories are going to come out, and it's not that easy. The divide is very, very strong, and sometimes it can't even be figured out just by looking at what people are saying, by looking at their concerns. Yes, and their concerns may be up and down the income ladder, but they may be still stifled voices.
Well, we talked a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement in terms of such a huge emergent story. Recently, are there any other emergent stories that you see as being significant that are coming through new media? I mean, David, you were saying that we're having such a lack of discussion around what's happening with the environment. It seems like there's an opportunity for new media to maybe play a role in raising awareness about that. Are stories emerging that people should be paying attention to through new media?
The Pope is in Cuba right now, but that has emerged. Well, I think the Pope actually is a tremendous story and is getting a good deal of attention.
And the Pope tweets, for anybody who doesn't know.
And the Pope tweets. Yeah. But again, foreign policy issues, domestic issues, the presidential campaign, there are all of these issues out there. But again, with the flood, people are absolutely saturated, and I'm concerned about that. How do we create the space to absorb this tsunami of data that's coming into our eyes and into our ears?
It's more than just data. See, sometimes what it is on Indian Twitter, people, I mean, the joke every morning is that you wake up in the morning and your first tweet is, what are we outraging about today? And the truth is, yes, I mean, it's wonderful to sort of, engage in a problem a day. And, there is something, 4 years ago, we didn't have as many people online as we do now. If David had been offloaded 4 years ago, I tweeted about it then, but there were, there were a fraction of people. We've really exploded in Indian Twitter in the past 4 years. But if it happened last week, which, it would, or it could, it would have become outrage of the day in a very real sense. The problem is that we cannot, it's not just a flood of data that's coming out, it's all at the same volume. So then you begin to lose, as a reader, as somebody sort of going down that feed, you lose your discrimination, you lose your ability to say, okay, this is a real issue, this is maybe not so important, this is less urgent, this is related to that. You're just outraging about the moment, step by step, day after day, and you're unable to then actually take action, because action requires prioritization, it requires linkages, it requires linking last Tuesday's outrage to today's, and that's not something that's easy to do with this feed, this flood.
And are there opportunities to change that, to help people navigate that deluge of things that are putting at us? Are things emerging?
There must be, but I mean, maybe, Ryan?
New technology to help
I think
us
you
navigate
probably know
new
smarter
technology.
people than I do.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't know that I have the answer to that.
Because I know there are all kinds of apps to help you sort your Twitter feed and your Facebook, but then you need an app to help sort that app, and it's all...
I think the tragedy is that then you can say, you know, a lot of those apps work on, you read this and this story is liked by people that you like. You know, one of the great important things must be to try and ensure that people are exposed to things that they disagree with as well. And whatever else you may say for old media, right? If you looked at the newspaper, you looked for the story that you like, you were frequently looking at stories that you didn't like.
Yeah, in order to get to that other
In order to get to the other stuff that you liked. So, not always, but I mean, at least that was something there. Now we seem to be, you know, we go on Facebook, our friends tell us what they're reading. If, you know, we pick our friends on the basis of similar opinions. Suddenly you're just there in your little valley of groupthink, and you don't actually know that you're in a valley. You think you're on a mountain, looking all the way out at the world, but you're actually surrounded by people who just think just like you. So I don't know if any app is going to actually force, you know, stuff that you don't like down your throat.
There's the danger of that reinforcing circle of opinion, you know, and so you hang out with people that you like to hang out with.
But it already exists on the internet. There are so many new media forms that actually push toward that.
How do we get people to sort of participate sometimes in things that they're uncomfortable with? What is the payoff to them? I mean, David, I mean, is there something that you can think of?
Just putting programs out there and hoping that people will listen, will share with others, and you know, get that information that's contrary to hegemonic thinking. I mean, as Orwell said, at any given time, there's a certain body of thought which is permissible, and you know, we're trying to break through that. But one of the things that concerns me about the internet and the technology also is there's a kind of faux activism attached to it. So I get a wonderful tweet from Ryan, I forward that to you, or you forward an email to me, and we think we're actually participating in some kind of social movement. But we're just moving data through cyberspace, and that can be very seductive. So there's no substitute for activism, for engagement, for community organizing.
And yet new media has been used to get people out on the streets. When we're seeing the Black Lives Matter movement or big rallies happening.
Or the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring in many ways. So there are, I suppose, so many facets to that.
Well, I think if we've found anything, as we're talking more and more about this, obviously it's the early days. We still don't completely understand what it is or how it's affecting us or how it's changing us. Of course there's a positive side, but there's also potentially a dark side. There are ways for it to be used well and humanely and positively, and there are ways for it to be used negatively depending on the ethics or morality or even, you know, persuasion of the person putting it out there. The thing that's kind of interesting, and it's difficult because I agree with a portion of what David is saying. I think there's something about finding a way to network communities, doing things like this, being face-to-face, being in the same room together and potentially being exposed to ideas you don't necessarily agree with, but you'll at least be open-minded enough to think about before potentially rejecting or thinking about it further. The thing that's difficult, and I think in a way, I found this when I was doing my research, and I did about 2.5 years of research on this, spoke with a tremendous amount of former Latino gang members, firefighters, nurses who had lived through the riots. And one of the things they told me is that, and this seemed to be almost a unified voice, I thought the world was one way, or I thought Los Angeles was one way, and then this happened. Which is really interesting, because you know, you can get locked into perhaps a certain type of thinking, and then the force of truth can literally come knocking on your door in potentially a terrifying way if you aren't at least open to seeing a broader dimension. Just to speak to a point earlier, you mentioned about the ways in emergent stories, and this is small, and forgive me for doing it. I'm a writer of fiction, so I'm quite in the literature box. But the thing that I found that I find so fascinating about Twitter, and forgive us for speaking so much about Twitter, but I think the reason why we're doing it is because it's a conversation engine. And we can do it across time zones, and we can interact with people we wouldn't necessarily interact with, and there's a very real beauty to that, I think, on a human level. But the thing that I love about it right now, especially in regard to English literature, or at least literature in the English language, is that we're finally having a dialogue and about really important things, especially the ways in which female writers are treated. Having a better sense of the diversity, honoring other voices, finding ways to grow the canon, so to speak. I think more of that has happened perhaps in the last 5 years than has happened perhaps in 100 years before, and that is incredibly valuable and incredibly important.
And it seems like stories that maybe would never have come to people's attention, talking about, say, Gamergate. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that term. It was a real exposition of how women, female gamers, video game players were just being treated in the most awful, misogynistic way.
Yeah,
and abusive way. And then that would never have, I'm sure, been written about in old media, maybe 20 years ago. But because of new media, that
exactly, it wouldn't have happened without people having this ability to anonymously ambush others, and in some cases issue death threats. And in some cases, put someone's, in the case of one prominent female game critic, put her address up there, put her phone number up there. I mean, that's terrifying. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, for me, Gamergate is quite personal because I was actually teaching a course on writing for video games when it happened, and my course was actually 60% female and 40% male, and I was trying to inspire the women to create change in the video game industry. And then something like that happened, and we had to have some very serious conversations about the inequality in the industry. And I had to sit with the men individually, and then I had to sit with the women individually. I had to talk to them about strategies to deal with abuse. I mean, it was so far beyond the scope of what I thought I signed up for, to teach an educational course. But it became incredibly important, and since then, I'm very glad to say, a number of those women have gone into the industry and are already creating change.
Have you written about this? This is...
I haven't, but I'd love to.
Really, really should.
Thank you, sir. I don't do a lot of journalism, but now you've got me thinking.
Emerging story. Emerging
stories, yes. Well, I'm sure one of our questions from the audience will be maybe about the anonymity of the internet, but we would like to open it up to the audience. If anybody has a question, please do raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone. Oh, lots of folks. We'll go right there in the front row.
I'm going to have to borrow one of yours, if you don't mind. Thanks. All right, front row, we'll start there.
I would like to pick up a theme that David mentioned, about environment. I'm a professor of hydrology. We are Mother Nature's plumbers. We deal with Mother Nature's plumbing. This is called the hydrological cycle. And as I look at the situation of water, which is tied to climate change, I'm not going to go into all that. It's really scary what is happening to water, not just privatization, pollution. And India is on the red list of Lester Brown, that India is in a very bad situation. How much you guys are tuning into that situation? Okay, so that's number one. Well, that water is tied to food, agriculture, and because of the wastage of water in growing crops and polluting the hell out of water. If you want, I will take you to Iowa on a field trip and show you what is happening in the US of A on that front, but it is not just Iowa, it is all over the world, including India. Then third is health. When you bring food and water, health comes piping into the equation. This country spends trillions of dollars in healthcare and stands 37th in the world. Well, what's going on? So we need to begin to frame the question involving public so they can tune into something. And that is David's job. I'll be willing to help you.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to ask another question? And is there a response to? All right. Is there a response? I don't know if there was a question in there.
On the water issue, for example, it has emerged. It is a huge topic. I don't usually quote the World Bank, but an Egyptian vice president a few years ago said that water will be the dominant issue in the 21st century. That was very prescient. The uprising in Syria is directly related to the drought in that country. It is one of the most water-stressed areas in the world. Yemen may be the first country in the world to run out of fresh water. There's serious parts of huge areas of West Asia and South Asia now that are classified as water-stressed. It will become, I believe, a dominant emerging issue. And if I can give a plug for my comrade, Maeve Conran here, she's been doing an award-winning series on water issues in Colorado. We just had a major spill on the Animas River near Durango, where hundreds of thousands of gallons of toxic wastes and metals were found their way into the aquifer and into the river stream. Based on that was a mining disaster. The EPA did something foolish and was somehow responsible for that spill. But what about all of the other mines in the state? This speaks to the essence of really existing capitalism in this country, which is when the profits are being made, they're privatized. When there are losses incurred, as when mines leach into the water system, then we, the public, pick up the tab. If we had honest economics departments in this country, they would be talking about that issue as well.
Hi. Yeah, so I would like to dovetail off of this discussion about the environment. We've talked about cynicism a little bit, and the amount of people that now feel a journalistic instinct to get on their social media and with their cell phones. Anyways, I was listening to a local talk show recently about how the new generation of young kids are so distant from nature because of all these kind of like apocalyptic talks, like all the things we're doing bad to the environment, and that potentially the best way, the kids are just losing interest altogether because they don't believe there will be nature left when they get older. And this is also pretty dramatic. But so an idea was, well, what if we inspired kids to go out in nature, to have a relationship with it so that they understood how it worked, so that they could develop their own experience with nature, and that would inspire them later on in their adult life to actually, help with these issues and get involved, not by being told you should, but because they actually want to. So I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on that with writing too, and maybe journalism or new media at all, as to how you can inspire maybe people to be less cynicism with writing, or the environment, both, by having a relationship with it, and how we can maybe build relationships through writing, to writing, in order to create less cynicism and more actual involvement in it?
Well, I would say stories make the most profound arguments. And Joseph Campbell, who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, when asked, what do you think the dominant myths of the next 100, 200 years might be, he answered, well, it's going to have to be green. It's going to have to be about the environment. It's going to have to be about the impending disasters, because these are stories that will help teach us what not to do. But then when he was pressed on, well, when will these start emerging, he didn't honestly know, and he's long since passed away, of course. And I wonder if this kind of connects to the other question as well. I don't think in some cases, that the storytellers, and perhaps I hate to even do this, speak as a fiction writer for other fiction writers, but unless it's present in one's environment, unless it's already a pressing panic, it doesn't necessarily create stories. But I think already, there were a number of films and books last year. There's a number of books about water running out. And I think as this continues to move forward, the stories will continue. Honestly, I think one can argue back and forth about anything when one has facts or a viewpoint, but the stories are this incredible engine that you can't argue with. And I think that's potentially, at least as far as fiction is concerned, one of the answers to the question.
And if I could just do a radio and new media plug. I'll just do a quick community radio and new media plug. Our sister radio station in Paonia, KVNF, started a national social media and community media project, I See Change, where members of the community went out and documented what they saw changing in the environment as a result of climate change, and a lot of very young people were getting involved with that, and that has now gone national. And so that is the power of people using digitized technology, digital technology, to go out in a new media way as well. So
and
I know we're close to finishing up, David.
If I could just add, I hate to use such a term as paradigm shift because it was so abused and overused for decades, but we need a radical rethinking of our view of nature. It is somehow we're detached from it. It's out there. It's not in here. And that kind of holistic approach, I think, is symbolized by a graffiti I saw attributed to Chief Seattle. Who knows if he said it or not, but it doesn't matter. He said, "We belong to the earth. The earth does not belong to us." And this notion that the earth is full of minerals and wealth and water, and we're going to harness it and make money off of it, that whole worldview has to be rethought.
Well, thank you all, Mihir.